The Vatican stands at the heart of Rome, a city whose streets echo with the weight of centuries. Behind its Renaissance palaces and soaring basilicas lies a sealed vault, a place often spoken of in whispers, the Vatican's secret archives. Few are allowed within its walls, and even fewer have glimpsed its shelves. For centuries, scholars have speculated that the archives contain not only the paperwork of popes and bishops, but also something far more consequential: manuscripts, maps, and relics that, if revealed, might rewrite the story of humanity itself. The idea is at once thrilling and unsettling. What if the truths we accept about human history are only fragments, and the rest lies hidden in the shadowed silence of this vast library? So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And while you're here, share your location and the local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where and when these stories are reaching you. The existence of the secret archives is no mystery. They were officially established in 1612 under Pope Paul V, a pontiff known for consolidating papal power during a turbulent era. He ordered that the records of the Church, which had until then been scattered or poorly guarded, be gathered and housed under the Vatican's control. This decision, while practical, also set in motion centuries of secrecy. Papal bulls, royal correspondence, treaties, and inquisitorial records began to accumulate behind locked doors, accessible only by those granted special permission. The papacy explained this as a measure to preserve order and protect sensitive documents. But even at the time, critics whispered that too much was being hidden from the world. The sheer scale of the archives is staggering. By conservative estimates, they contain more than 85 kilometers of shelving, with tens of thousands of volumes, letters, and parchments. The name Secret Archives derives not from scandal, but from the Latin archivum secretum apostolicum Vaticanum, where secretum means private or personal. Yet for centuries the aura of secrecy has lingered, inviting speculation. Historians are still debating whether the strict control was meant to shield political alliances, protect the faithful from troubling contradictions, or to safeguard something stranger. Knowledge too disruptive for the world to see. From the very beginning, rumors swirled about what might lie hidden within. Some suggested the archives hold the missing books of Livy, the Roman historian whose monumental work on the rise of Rome was lost in antiquity. Others whispered of letters between emperors and popes revealing how deeply the Church influenced imperial policies. A few went further, imagining manuscripts from even earlier civilizations, fragments of Egyptian temple records, or scrolls salvaged from the Library of Alexandria before it burned. The strangeness of the archives lies not only in their contents but also in their silence. For much of their history, access was all but impossible. Until 1881, no outside scholar could enter. Before that, popes and their chosen clerics alone held the keys. When Pope Leo XIII opened limited access in the 19th century, it was hailed as a moment of progress. Yet even then, researchers could only view materials approved by Vatican officials. This partial transparency has left space for endless conjecture. Some argue that the most dangerous text remains sealed away in sub-levels never catalogued for outsiders. Stranger stories began to circulate in Europe during the Enlightenment. Writers claimed that monks had stumbled upon manuscripts describing not just the lives of saints, but accounts of celestial events and floods that predated biblical records. Others alleged that notes on forbidden sciences, alchemy, astrology, even rudimentary mechanics, were stored under lock and key, ideas that could have altered the trajectory of human invention had they been made public. The archival silence also left room for more mythical possibilities, whether documents describing lost continents, or letters detailing encounters with unknown peoples before the Age of Discovery. Could the Church have hidden such accounts to protect its monopoly on truth? Hypotheses of this kind, though speculative, illustrate how easily the human imagination fills the gaps left by secrecy. Historians are still debating whether such conjectures reveal anything about the archives themselves, or simply about our enduring fear of concealed knowledge. A peculiar episode occurred in the late 19th century when rumors spread of an internal catalog describing texts too sensitive to release. The list supposedly contained entries such as On the Origins of Man and treatises from the ancients. No scholar has ever confirmed the existence of such a catalog, but the story fueled generations of conspiracy. Was it merely an invention of curious minds, or a glimpse of a darker reality, one where the Church decided what the world was allowed to remember? Even stranger are the off-topic tales woven into the archive's legend. In the 1920s, a group of Italian journalists circulated claims that a locked chamber contained correspondence with figures who should never have been able to write to the papacy. Letters attributed to mythical kings or to ancient priests long vanished before Christianity itself emerged. The Vatican dismissed such claims outright, yet the fact that such rumors persist reflects the potent aura of the archives. The secrecy surrounding the vaults has led many to wonder whether truth itself might sleep within them. If the Church possesses documents that challenge accepted timelines of civilization, that reveal knowledge long assumed lost, or that expose political manipulation stretching back millennia, the implications would be profound. Humanity's sense of its own past could shift in a single revelation. Whether that revelation is one of wonder or unease remains uncertain. The opening of this journey lies not in what is known, but in what is concealed. The archives are a labyrinth of parchment and shadow, their silence a provocation. They are less a repository of knowledge than a mirror reflecting humanity's deep suspicion that somewhere the full story is being kept from view. To enter the narrative of the secret archives is to step into a threshold space, balance between history and myth, fact and speculation. The story of the Vatican's archives begins not in the grand halls of the modern papal palace, but in the labyrinth of older libraries, monasteries, and imperial treasuries scattered across Europe. For centuries before their official creation, bishops and popes had accumulated manuscripts, charters, and letters, some gifted by monarchs, others seized in conquest, still others copied laboriously by monks intent on preserving fragile texts. By the 16th century, these records had become so numerous and so politically valuable that their dispersal posed a danger. To lose a treaty or papal bull could unravel claims of authority. To misplace correspondence might reveal weakness to rivals. In 1612, Pope Paul V ordered the collection consolidated into a single guarded institution, thus establishing what became known as the Vatican's secret archives. Paul V himself was a figure shaped by the turbulence of his age. Born Camillo Borghese, he rose during an era when the Catholic Church sought to reassert its authority in the wake of the Protestant Reformation. The Council of Trent had concluded a few decades earlier, reshaping doctrine and centralizing control. For Paul V, securing the Church's knowledge was as crucial as guarding its lands or armies. He decreed that the archives be locked and available only to those with papal permission. This was not merely bureaucracy. It was a declaration that knowledge itself was power, and that the Church alone would decide who might wield it. The early contents of the archives reflected the Church's global reach. Records from inquisitions across Europe filled shelves with testimonies, confessions, and edicts. Diplomatic correspondence arrived from royal courts in Spain, France, and the Holy Roman Empire. Maps of faraway territories, some based on explorers' accounts, others derived from hearsay, were carefully folded and stacked. The archive was less a library than a vault of influence. To control history was, in a sense, to control the future. Yet even from the beginning, speculation thrived. What else was being hidden, aside from royal decrees and papal edicts? Historians are still debating whether Paul V's secrecy was driven by fear of heresy, by a need to shield political strategies, or by something more elusive, the preservation of documents that challenged established narratives of the past. The fact that the archives grew steadily through centuries of upheaval only fueled the intrigue. The 17th century was a time when Europe reeled from religious wars, shifting alliances and discoveries overseas. Jesuit missionaries returned from China, India, and the Americas carrying letters, artifacts, and reports of cultures unlike anything Europe had known. Many of these were forwarded to Rome, where they entered the papal collections. Some described customs that clashed with European notions of morality. Others hinted at histories stretching far deeper than the biblical timeline allowed. Whether these accounts were celebrated, hidden, or quietly altered remains uncertain. An authoritative reference often cited in discussions of the archives is the case of Galileo Galilei. His trial records, preserved under Vatican control, remain among the most studied documents from the period. They reveal how a man who challenged geocentric cosmology faced censure, not simply for science, but for contradicting the theological interpretations safeguarded by the Church. That the archives maintained such meticulous records of the proceedings demonstrates how central secrecy and documentation were to papal authority. Yet scholars wonder what else was recorded at the same time. Observations, perhaps, that confirmed Galileo's claims but were judged too dangerous to circulate. The hypothesis that the archives hold scrolls older than the Church itself gains traction when considering how manuscripts circulated during the Renaissance. Wealthy collectors, including cardinals, competed to acquire Greek and Roman texts, unearthed from monasteries or brought from the East after the fall of Constantinople in 1453. Many of these works challenged the medieval worldview, introducing philosophies and sciences that predated Christian doctrine. While some were published and studied openly, others may have been deemed unsuitable for widespread circulation and quietly absorbed into the Vatican's private holdings. Among the stranger episodes connected to this era is the tale of a papal envoy returning from Egypt, who claimed to have acquired papyri describing lost dynasties predating biblical chronology. According to scattered notes, these papyri were taken to Rome and then disappeared from view. Whether they were fraudulent, misinterpreted, or truly ancient remains an open question. Historians are still debating the credibility of such accounts, but the story illustrates the climate of secrecy that surrounded the archives from the beginning. The politics of Europe further contributed to the archive's growth. Kings often entrusted their most sensitive agreements to the papacy, viewing the Vatican as a neutral authority capable of safeguarding documents through dynastic turmoil. The Treaty of Tordesillas, which divided the New World between Spain and Portugal in 1494, was preserved in these collections, its presence reminding future ages of how papal authority once extended across oceans. But if such agreements found their way into the archives, what of the less publicized ones? The arrangements struck in secret, the concessions made in shadow. Curiously, some rumors about the archives stem not from clerics, but from travelers and scholars who claim to have seen glimpses of restricted shelves. In the 18th century, the French scholar Louis de Beaufort suggested that the Vatican held chronicles of early Rome, contradicting the heroic myths preserved by Livy. If such documents existed, they could have revealed that Rome's founding legends were more invention than fact. Though no proof of Beaufort's claim survives, his suggestion continues to haunt discussions of the archives. What if our most cherished historical narratives rest on carefully curated omissions? The archive's aura of secrecy made it fertile ground for strange and off-topic legends. In one peculiar story, whispered among visitors to Rome, a monk was said to have stumbled on a manuscript describing lands beyond the Atlantic centuries before Columbus. The Vatican supposedly suppressed it to protect the narrative of discovery as a divine mission. While almost certainly apocryphal, the tale reflects how easily the human imagination fills the void left by restricted access. Over time, the very idea of the archives grew into something larger than its shelves. It became a symbol of control, a reminder that behind every official chronicle of history lies another record, hidden, redacted, or withheld. The fact that the Vatican maintained one of the most comprehensive repositories in the world only intensified the suspicion. Was the Church a guardian of knowledge, or a gatekeeper deciding what truths humanity could bear. The origins of the archives remind us that secrecy is not always sinister. It can also be practical, a way of preserving fragile documents and sensitive information. Yet the very act of concealment breeds speculation. The foundation laid by Paul V in 1612 set the stage for centuries of debate about what is hidden and why. Whether the archives are simply a vast collection of administrative records or a vault of truth that could upend history remains uncertain. The line between fact and conjecture, between the known and the imagined, has blurred ever since those first locks were turned on the doors. Among the countless rumors attached to the Vatican's vaults, one of the most persistent concerns the presence of scrolls older than Christianity itself. If true, their existence would mean that the archives are not only a record of church affairs, but also a repository of humanity's deepest past, preserving fragile texts that escape the ravages of time and war. The possibility alone has fascinated scholars and conspiracy theorists alike, for these manuscripts could challenge accepted timelines, reveal forgotten empires, or shed light on the origins of traditions still alive today. When the Roman Empire absorbed the Mediterranean world, its officials gathered immense quantities of written material, decrees, correspondence, temple inventories, and philosophical works. Much of this knowledge was scattered after the empire's collapse. Some was lost to flames, as at the Library of Alexandria, while other fragments survived in monasteries. Yet the Church, positioned at the center of late antiquity, acquired many of these materials. Some were brought to Rome by clerics traveling from the East, others gifted by rulers who hoped to curry papal favor. As early as the 4th century, bishops in Rome were known to collect pagan works, not to celebrate them, but to better refute them. Over centuries, those collections grew until they formed the backbone of what later popes consolidated into the archives. An authoritative reference to this tradition can be seen in the writings of Isidore of Seville, a 7th-century scholar whose encyclopedic Etymologiae drew on countless ancient sources. Isidore preserved fragments of texts that would otherwise be unknown, leading historians to suggest that the Church, by accident or design, became a custodian of antiquity. If works like these reached later popes, it is not impossible that still older manuscripts, Babylonian tablets, Egyptian papyri, or Greek philosophical treatises were copied and stored in Rome. Historians are still debating whether such materials genuinely survive in the Vatican today, or whether the idea is a projection of our longing for lost knowledge. Some point to catalog entries describing manuscripts of unknown origin deposited during the Renaissance. Others highlight the movements of crusaders who plundered libraries from Constantinople to Jerusalem and sometimes delivered their spoils to Rome. The Fourth Crusade in 1204, notorious for its sack of Byzantium, funneled an immense quantity of manuscripts westward. Not all were destroyed. Some may have been hidden for safekeeping, carried into the very vaults that would become the Vatican's archives. One particularly tantalizing hypothesis concerns the Sibylline books. These oracular texts, originally housed in the Temple of Jupiter in Rome, were consulted by emperors during crises. Though burned in the 5th century, whispers persisted that fragments survived, copied by early Christian scholars. Could remnants of these prophecies, once said to predict the rise and fall of civilizations, lie within the Vatican's sealed shelves? The Church has never confirmed such claims, but their possibility continues to haunt the imagination. Equally compelling are suggestions of Egyptian records preserved by Christian converts. During the first centuries of Christianity, Alexandria was a vital hub of faith and philosophy. Papyrus texts circulated freely. Hymns, gospels, temple accounts, and medical treatises. As persecution fled, believers fled with what they could carry. Some made their way to Rome. A story, though never substantiated, claims that in the 3rd century, a bishop delivered to the Pope papyri describing dynasties of Egypt older than the flood of Noah. If genuine, such records would stretch human history beyond biblical chronology, raising questions the Church may have wished to avoid. Strange and off-topic stories also persist about the survival of Greek works thought lost. In the 17th century, an Italian antiquarian boasted that he had seen manuscripts of Heraclitus and Democritus in papal custody, describing philosophies that questioned not only gods but the fabric of reality. Modern scholars regard the claim with skepticism, yet it illustrates how quickly the mind leaps to the possibility of hidden wisdom whenever secrecy is involved. The most widely repeated rumor is that the archives hold fragments from the Library of Alexandria. According to this story, before the city's great collections were consumed by fire, certain texts were removed and sent west as gifts or bribes to Roman officials. These texts, it is said, traveled eventually to Rome and later to the Vatican. Among them were said to be astronomical treatises describing planets invisible to the naked eye, histories of lost continents, and accounts of floods striking long before human memory. No evidence has surfaced to support this, yet the idea remains captivating. If true, such manuscripts could dramatically expand humanity's view of its own past. Open scholarly debate centers on whether the Vatican's secrecy merely fuels these legends. Some historians argue that nothing extraordinary lies within, only bureaucratic records, diplomatic papers, and ecclesiastical decrees. Others counter that the sheer volume of the collection makes it statistically inevitable that fragments of antiquity survive inside. In either case, access remains limited, leaving the question unanswered. There are modern examples of discoveries that give weight to such speculation. In the late 19th century, scholars examining the Vatican's Greek manuscripts uncovered forgotten homilies of Origen, an early Christian theologian. In the 20th century, papal scholars revealed ancient Assyrian tablets that had quietly rested in the collections. These discoveries remind us that older works do surface, sometimes unexpectedly, lending credence to the idea that much remains unseen. One peculiar episode took place in the 1930s, when a German researcher claimed to have seen a parchment describing Atlantis, written in Greek, referencing Plato's dialogues, but offering details absent from the known texts. The Vatican dismissed the claim as invention, yet the story spread widely. Even if apocryphal, it illustrates how the archives have become a canvas for humanity's greatest myths. The hypothesis of scrolls older than Rome lingers not because of proof, but because of possibility. The Church has acted for centuries as a collector of the world's fragments, intentionally or not. Empires have fallen, libraries burned, civilizations erased, yet the Vatican has remained a constant, quietly absorbing what survived. If even a small portion of those materials are older than Christianity, they could illuminate forgotten epochs of human history. Whether such texts lie gathering dust behind locked doors is a question left deliberately unanswered, and perhaps that silence is the most provocative answer of all. If the Vatican's archives truly shelter the remnants of forgotten civilizations, then one of their most controversial holdings would surely be the hidden Gospels. The very fabric of Christianity rests on a small number of canonical texts, the four Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, chosen in the early centuries to form the official narrative of Christ's life and teachings. Yet history reveals that many other accounts once circulated among believers. Some were revered in certain communities, others condemned as heretical. Over time, the Church sought to suppress these alternative voices, but scholars have long suspected that copies survived, and that the Vatican's sealed shelves may still cradle them. The process of canonization itself was complex and deeply political. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Christian communities across the Mediterranean told stories of Jesus in differing ways. Some emphasized his divinity, others his humanity. Some spoke of secret teachings given only to a few disciples. The Council of Nicaea in 325 did not itself fix the biblical canon, but it set the stage for later councils and bishops to do so. By the 4th century, Athanasius of Alexandria listed the 27 books of the New Testament that we recognize today. The rest were declared apocryphal, excluded from the official canon, and often destroyed. But exclusion did not always mean obliteration. Manuscripts circulated in private, hidden in caves, or copied in secret. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi Library in Egypt in 1945 provided stunning proof of this. Buried in jars were texts like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, all presenting radically different visions of Jesus' teachings. These discoveries reignited speculation that the Vatican, too, had preserved its own cache of apocryphal Gospels, sealed away from public view. Historians are still debating whether such texts exist in the papal archives or whether they are confined to the archaeological record. An authoritative reference to this debate comes from the writings of Irenaeus, a 2nd century bishop who railed against what he called heresies. His work against heresies condemns the diversity of gospels circulating in his time. By denouncing them, he inadvertently recorded their existence. Many of these same texts resurfaced at Nag Hammadi. Could others, unrecorded by Irenaeus, have slipped quietly into Rome's custody? The hypothesis is not far-fetched. The early church often collected heretical writings, not to preserve them, but to better combat them. Copyists in monasteries would transcribe even condemned texts, adding marginal notes refuting their claims. If such manuscripts were brought to Rome, the Vatican might have kept them for the same reason it preserved Galileo's trial records, as evidence of dangerous ideas, useful to study but perilous to release. The Gospel of Judas, discovered in the 1970s and published decades later, is a case in point. It presents Judas not as a betrayer, but as a chosen disciple fulfilling Jesus' command. Its existence shocked the modern world, yet references to such a gospel existed as early as the writings of church fathers. Scholars wonder, if one copy survived in an Egyptian cave, could another lie in the Vatican's sealed vaults, preserved but never acknowledged? Another tantalizing possibility is the so-called Gospel of Barnabas, which portrays Jesus as a prophet rather than the Son of God. This text is often cited in debates between Christianity and Islam, for it seems to bridge elements of both faiths. While the known manuscripts are medieval and disputed, rumors persist that earlier versions lie locked away in Rome. The Church has never confirmed such claims, but the whispers continue, fueling the idea that the Vatican holds documents too destabilizing to reveal. Stranger stories surround the supposed Gospel of Eve, a text that allegedly offered mystical visions and esoteric teachings. Early Christian writers condemned it as heretical, and no full copy has survived. Yet in the 19th century, a scholar claimed that the Vatican possessed fragments, shown to him briefly before vanishing again into obscurity. The credibility of this claim is contested, but its very persistence shows how deeply the notion of hidden gospels has embedded itself in historical imagination. A peculiar off-topic tale from the 17th century adds another layer of mystery. A Jesuit missionary returning from Ethiopia claimed to have seen an ancient gospel used by local Christians, one that described Jesus traveling eastward after the resurrection. The missionary brought notes to Rome, where they were said to be deposited in the papal collections. Nothing further was heard of them. Whether this was a misunderstanding, a fabrication, or a genuine fragment of lost tradition remains unresolved. The existence of hidden gospels raises troubling questions. If these texts were ever acknowledged, they could reshape Christianity's foundations. They might present Jesus as a mystic philosopher, a political reformer, or a revealer of secret wisdom. They might elevate women as apostles, as in the Gospel of Mary, challenging centuries of tradition. They might suggest that betrayal was obedience, or that salvation was knowledge rather than faith. Such ideas would not only unsettle theology, but also alter the trajectory of Western culture. Historians are still debating whether the Church suppressed these writings out of fear, or simply excluded them as divergent voices in a crowded field. Some argue that canonization was necessary to create unity. Others claim it was a political act, narrowing a diverse movement into a single orthodoxy. Either way, the Vatican's silence on what it holds continues to invite speculation. New discoveries like Nag Hammadi remind us that forgotten texts do emerge, sometimes after lying hidden for millennia. Each revelation adds weight to the possibility that more survive in Rome. The question is not only whether they exist, but whether humanity is ready to read them. Would the faithful embrace a wider vision of Christ, or would centuries of devotion unravel in the face of contradiction? The answer lies, perhaps literally, behind locked doors. The hidden Gospels stand as a symbol of the archives themselves, knowledge present but concealed, truths that may never see light. Whether they are dusty manuscripts bound in leather or only imagined by hopeful minds, they remind us that history is always more complex than the official story. The silence of the Vatican on this matter is as eloquent as any proclamation, a silence that invites endless wonder. The shadows of the Vatican's vaults are not only filled with Gospels and Chronicles, but also with whispers of forbidden sciences. For centuries, Europe wrestled with the tension between discovery and dogma, between knowledge that illuminated and knowledge that threatened. The Church encouraged study in many areas: astronomy for calculating Easter, medicine for caring for the sick, philosophy for sharpening theology. Yet there were limits. Cross those limits, and one risked charges of heresy, excommunication, or worse. This uneasy balance has led many to believe that the Vatican archives became not only a storehouse for the approved wisdom of the world, but also a burial ground for ideas considered too dangerous to reveal. The Renaissance, with its feverish revival of classical learning, provides a fitting stage for such speculation. Scholars rediscovered manuscripts by Aristotle, Galen, and Euclid. Their works challenged medieval interpretations of the cosmos, health, and mathematics. While some of these were studied openly, others provoked unease. The rediscovery of heliocentric theories, first suggested by ancient Greeks, later revived by Copernicus, upended theological assumptions about humanity's central place in creation. These ideas entered the Vatican's awareness quickly, especially as Copernicus dedicated his On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres to Pope Paul III. Yet despite initial acceptance, the Church grew wary when Galileo championed it with telescopic evidence. His trial, preserved in the archives, stands as one of history's clearest examples of the collision between science and doctrine. Historians are still debating whether Galileo's condemnation was motivated more by theological rigidity or by political pressures within the Counter-Reformation. What is certain is that his manuscripts, transcripts, and letters were preserved by the Vatican. This raises a troubling question. If such records were kept, how many other works of controversial science remain buried there, perhaps silenced not by public flames, but by quiet shelving? Alchemy offers another tantalizing thread. Long before chemistry emerged as a disciplined science, alchemy was pursued across Europe and the Middle East. Practitioners sought not only to transmute metals, but also to unlock the secrets of life itself. In Islamic lands, scholars like Jabir bin Hayyan recorded sophisticated experiments, blending mystical symbolism with practical discovery. When these works reached Europe, they attracted the attention of both monarchs and priests. Some alchemical texts found their way into papal libraries. Yet because alchemy was tied to notions of forbidden power, the creation of gold, the elixir of immortality, it often provokes suspicion. There are persistent rumors that the Vatican preserved some of the rarest alchemical manuscripts, storing them not for public inquiry but to prevent their misuse. Medicine, too, had its forbidden frontiers. Ancient medical texts often contained knowledge of herbs, surgeries, and treatments considered unorthodox by medieval standards. Some even described techniques for contraception or abortion, matters the Church opposed. If such texts survived, the Vatican may have sequestered them. One example often cited, though never proven, is a manuscript said to describe surgical procedures from Alexandria, far more advanced than anything practiced in medieval Europe. While modern historians caution against romanticizing ancient medicine, the mere possibility stirs curiosity. Could humanity's progress have been faster if knowledge had not been hidden? Another frontier of forbidden science was astronomy. Medieval Europe inherited the Ptolemaic system, with Earth at the center. The observations from Arabic and Persian scholars challenged its accuracy. Some manuscripts described planetary models closer to heliocentrism. These works, translated into Latin, reached Europe by the 12th century. Did the Vatican copy and store them, waiting for a safe moment to release their findings? Some argue yes, noting that Jesuit astronomers of the 17th century were remarkably skilled, hinting at access to broader knowledge than publicly admitted. Strange tales also attach themselves to the archives. In the 18th century, a rumor spread that the Vatican had confiscated a manuscript describing a perpetual motion device, supposedly devised by a German inventor. The Church, it was said, feared the disruption of natural order and locked it away. No evidence supports this story, but its persistence illustrates how the archives became a canvas for anxieties about suppressed innovation. A more peculiar anecdote arises from the 19th century, when a French traveler claimed that among the sealed manuscripts was a medieval text describing machines powered by steam, centuries before the Industrial Revolution. Whether this was imagination, fabrication, or a misreading of ancient technical drawings is unknown. Historians are still debating whether such claims should be dismissed outright, or whether they reflect the real possibility that technological experiments were more advanced than the official record suggests. One hypothesis suggests that the Vatican's suppression of certain sciences was not intended solely to protect theology, but also to protect stability. Knowledge is power, but power in the wrong hands could destabilize societies already fragile from war, famine, and revolt. If someone had truly devised weapons or devices ahead of their time, perhaps the safest course was silence. This pragmatic explanation does not erase the air of secrecy. Instead, it deepens the sense of mystery. At the heart of this debate lies the Index of Forbidden Books, first issued in the 16th century. This list catalogued works Catholics were forbidden to read, ranging from heretical theology to scientific treatises. Galileo's writings appeared on it, as did works by Copernicus. The index itself demonstrates the Church's desire to police the boundaries of knowledge. But what happened to the actual books once forbidden? Were they destroyed, or were they quietly locked away in the archives? Scholars continue to argue, but the possibility that they were preserved rather than burned adds weight to the notion that the Vatican has quietly safeguarded humanity's most disruptive ideas. The strange irony is that many of these forbidden sciences have since become cornerstones of modernity. Chemistry grew from alchemy. Astronomy shattered geocentrism. Medicine advanced beyond medieval superstition. The very knowledge once feared has become the foundation of our world. Yet the lingering question remains: what if even more lies hidden? Knowledge that could alter the future as profoundly as these sciences did the past. The archives, in this light, are not merely a place of secrecy, but a threshold of possibility. Behind their locked doors may rest humanity's discarded experiments, its silenced discoveries, its unrealized revolutions. Whether kept from malice, fear, or prudence, these manuscripts suggest that the history of science is not simply one of progress, but of careful curation. Choices about what to reveal and what to conceal. In those choices lies the power to shape civilizations. If the Vatican's archives truly extend beyond the boundaries of ordinary history, then few subjects provoke more fascination than the idea of lost civilizations. The notion that the human story stretches back further than we acknowledge has haunted imaginations for centuries. Myths of Atlantis, Lemuria, and other forgotten worlds recur across cultures, appearing in Greek philosophy, Hindu epics, and indigenous oral traditions. Could it be that documents hidden in the Vatican preserve knowledge of such places, records that challenge the accepted narrative of when and where civilization began. The myth of Atlantis, first described by Plato in the Timaeus and Critias, has long been a touchstone for speculation. Plato wrote of a powerful island empire that sank beneath the waves thousands of years before his time. Most scholars view it as allegory, a philosophical warning against hubris. Yet across Europe, many have wondered if fragments of historical truth underlie the tale. If so, evidence may have reached Rome through travelers, traders, or scholars. Some hypothesize that early Christian scribes keen to refute pagan myths may have copied and stored such texts. If any survived, they might well lie deep in the Vatican shelves. Historians are still debating whether the Church would have preserved such material as cultural curiosities or suppressed them to protect biblical chronology. Equally enduring is the legend of Lemuria, a hypothetical sunken continent proposed in the 19th century to explain the distribution of lemurs and similar species. Though later disproven by plate tectonics, the idea resonated with occult traditions that spoke of a primordial civilization erased by cataclysm. Strangely, theosophical writings of the late Victorian era claimed that ancient records of Lemuria survived in secret, guarded by monastic orders. Some even suggested that the Vatican, through its Jesuit networks, had secured such records from Asia. No evidence supports this, but the connection between lost continents and Vatican secrecy persists in speculative literature. More grounded, though still controversial, is the possibility that ancient maps exist within the archives, describing coastlines as they appeared long before modern exploration. The Piri Reis map, drawn by an Ottoman admiral in 1513, famously depicts parts of South America and Antarctica with puzzling accuracy. Historians have argued that the map was compiled from older sources, perhaps classical or even pre-classical. If such source maps survived, where might they be? Some point to the Vatican, whose global reach and missionary networks made it a natural repository for cartographic treasures. A single scroll showing Antarctica free of ice would radically alter our understanding of human antiquity. Authoritative references to ancient catastrophe come from the works of early church fathers. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the 5th century, acknowledged that pagan traditions spoke of repeated destructions of humanity by fire and flood. He interpreted them through a biblical lens, but his awareness shows that stories of lost civilizations circulated widely. If clerics preserved such accounts, the archives could hold versions untainted by later theological framing. Strange anecdotes fuel this speculation further. In the 17th century, a Jesuit missionary in South America allegedly sent reports describing vast stone ruins in the jungle, built by a people unknown to local tribes. His letters, some say, were forwarded to Rome and never seen again. Modern archaeology has indeed uncovered lost cities in the Amazon, lending a curious credibility to these centuries-old whispers. Whether the Vatican holds the original documents remains uncertain, but the coincidence is striking. Another peculiar episode concerns a rumored manuscript known as the Chronicle of the Sea Peoples. In the early 20th century, an Italian scholar claimed he had glimpsed references to such a document in the Vatican, describing migrations that destroyed Bronze Age civilizations. Mainstream historians now recognize the Sea Peoples as a factor in that collapse. Yet much remains mysterious. Could the Vatican's sealed shelves hold eyewitness accounts, perhaps copied from Egyptian scribes, that illuminate this lost chapter of history? Historians are still debating whether such claims are plausible or mere inventions of imaginative researchers. The hypothesis that the Vatican conceals records of lost civilizations ties into a broader debate about humanity's timeline. Conventional archaeology places the rise of complex societies around 6,000 years ago, with writing emerging in Mesopotamia. Yet discoveries like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, a monumental site more than 11,000 years old, suggest that human culture was organized long before the accepted dawn of history. If such surprises can be unearthed in stone, might similar surprises remain hidden in parchment? Perhaps missionaries, travelers, or crusaders encountered traditions of forgotten epochs and recorded them, only for their writings to be filed away in Rome. One off-topic but intriguing story involves the supposed travels of Saint Brendan, an Irish monk said to have sailed westward in the 6th century. Medieval manuscripts describe his journey to the Isle of the Blessed, which some later interpreted as North America. Could the Vatican possess accounts of this voyage, lending weight to the idea that Europeans knew of the Americas long before Columbus? If true, such records would disrupt cherished narratives of discovery and exploration. The allure of lost civilizations lies not only in what they reveal, but in what they imply. If humanity has risen and fallen multiple times, then the current era is not unique but part of a cycle. Civilizations could collapse under flood, fire, or famine, leaving only fragments for the next age to puzzle over. The archives, if they preserve such fragments, might hold the keys to understanding humanity's forgotten past, and perhaps to avoiding its repetition. The Vatican's silence on these matters is itself telling. By neither confirming nor denying, it allows speculation to thrive. Whether this is intentional or incidental, the effect is the same. The archives loom as a repository not just of ecclesiastical paperwork, but of the deepest mysteries of human origin. Perhaps no scrolls of Atlantis or Lemuria lie within, only routine correspondence and treaties. Or perhaps the silence conceals something too transformative to release, a knowledge that humanity's story is older, stranger, and more fragile than we have ever imagined. Legends of lost civilizations often intertwine with tales of catastrophic events, floods, fires, and upheavals so vast that they reset the course of humanity. The archives of the Vatican, if they contain records older than Christianity, might also preserve accounts of disasters that shape the myths of every culture. For centuries, scholars have wondered if the Great Flood of the Bible is just one memory of a worldwide cataclysm, echoed in Mesopotamian epics, in Native American traditions, and in the oral histories of Pacific Islanders. If the Vatican's sealed vaults house chronicles of these events, they may hold the missing pieces of a global puzzle, why civilizations rose, fell, and vanished into memory. The earliest written flood narrative known to us is the Epic of Gilgamesh, carved on clay tablets in Mesopotamia more than 4,000 years ago. In it, a man named Utnapishtim survives a deluge by building a vast boat, saving his family and animals, an account strikingly similar to Noah's story in Genesis. Biblical writers likely knew of this tale, yet historians are still debating whether both derive from an even older, shared tradition of catastrophe. If the Church inherited Mesopotamian fragments through trade, conquest, or missionary encounters, they may have chosen to keep such parallels hidden to preserve biblical primacy. Beyond floods, other disasters loom large in human memory. Ancient chronicles speak of fiery objects streaking through the sky, flattening forests or scorching cities. Modern scientists now interpret these as meteor impacts. The Tunguska event of 1908 in Siberia offered a chilling modern parallel, a cosmic explosion leveling thousands of square kilometers of forest. What if such events were witnessed in antiquity, recorded by scribes, and preserved in archives the Vatican later acquired? A parchment describing the sudden destruction of a Bronze Age city by fire from heaven might once have been labeled divine punishment. Today it might be read as evidence of celestial impact. Earthquakes and volcanic eruptions also echo through ancient stories. The destruction of Pompeii in 79 CE is well documented, its people frozen in volcanic ash. But other cataclysms, like the eruption of Santorini around 1600 BCE, may have erased entire cultures. Some scholars link this eruption to the collapse of the Minoan civilization, and even to the birth of the Atlantis legend. Did ancient sailors record such destruction? Their accounts later absorbed into church collections. Historians are still debating whether the Vatican shelters documents that trace these links, connecting myth and geology. Authoritative evidence of such preservation comes from the chronicles of early church historians like Eusebius, who quoted from lost works describing ancient kings, floods, and strange celestial signs. The Vatican certainly holds manuscripts of Eusebius, but what of the sources he cited, works by Berossus, Manetho, or others now missing from history? If copies survive anywhere, the safest bet may be the Vatican's locked shelves. The hypothesis extends further, that the archives might preserve accounts of catastrophes predating written history, carried orally for generations before being committed to parchment. In this view, the global flood myths, though varied, all point back to real events at the end of the last ice age, when rising seas swallowed coastlines worldwide. Archaeology has confirmed massive flooding around 10,000 BCE. Could missionaries who heard indigenous traditions in the Americas or Asia have recorded stories echoing this era and sent them back to Rome? The idea is not impossible. Curious anecdotes reinforce this speculation. In the 19th century, a Jesuit scholar reportedly described a manuscript in the Vatican detailing a great burning sky over Gaul, written by Roman witnesses. The account never surfaced publicly. Was it simply misfiled, or quietly withheld because it suggested natural disasters beyond biblical explanation? Such tales, whether true or not, underscore the enduring suspicion that knowledge of catastrophe has been sequestered. One peculiar off-topic story tells of a 17th-century sailor who claimed to have seen maps in Rome showing coastlines submerged beneath the Atlantic. He believed they were relics of the flood that drowned Atlantis. No scholar ever confirmed his claim, yet his words entered the lore of lost knowledge. They serve as another reminder that the archives, by their very secrecy, invite speculation as wild as it is persistent. New discoveries in geology and archaeology only strengthen the sense of mystery. Modern scientists have identified layers of sediment in ice cores suggesting abrupt climate shifts, comet strikes, and massive volcanic winters in the distant past. These findings make it plausible that ancient observers did record such catastrophes. The Vatican, as a centuries-old collector of manuscripts, could well hold some of those records. What they would reveal is another matter: that human civilization may not be a steady march of progress, but a fragile tapestry often torn apart by forces beyond control. Historians are still debating the extent to which myth can be read as history. Some argue that stories of floods and fires are symbolic, moral tales. Others insist they are dim memories of real disasters, faithfully passed down. In either case, the presence of corroborating documents in the Vatican would be transformative. They could shift the flood from a matter of faith to a matter of history, placing biblical stories within a broader human framework. If such documents exist, they pose profound questions. Why keep them secret? Was the intent to avoid undermining Scripture? To prevent panic about humanity's vulnerability? Or perhaps simply to preserve them until a time when they could be better understood? Whatever the reason, their silence reverberates through the ages. The archive stands not just as a vault of church memory, but as a potential library of human catastrophe, waiting for the day its pages might again see light. As the centuries passed, one period came to embody the idea of lost knowledge more than any other: the so-called Dark Ages. According to the traditional narrative, Europe collapsed into ignorance after the fall of Rome. Libraries decayed, science stagnated, and the wisdom of the ancients disappeared until the Renaissance breathed life back into the West. But historians are still debating whether this image of darkness is entirely true. Increasingly, scholars recognize that learning continued in monasteries, in Byzantium, and in the Islamic world, even as Europe struggled with war and famine. If the Vatican's archives conceal the records of this era, they might provide evidence that the Dark Ages were not as dark as legend suggests, or perhaps that the shadows were cast deliberately to obscure truths inconvenient to later rulers. The collapse of Rome in the 5th century left a vacuum of power and knowledge. Germanic tribes moved into former imperial territories, establishing kingdoms with their own laws and customs. The infrastructure of empire crumbled, roads went unrepaired, aqueducts failed, and great cities shrank. Yet monasteries arose as centers of learning. Monks copied manuscripts, preserved fragments of classical literature, and recorded the annals of their time. Many of these texts eventually made their way to Rome, entrusted to the papacy as the one enduring authority amid chaos. The archives thus became a bridge across centuries, storing both the remnants of antiquity and the first flickers of medieval learning. One authoritative reference to this transmission is the work of Cassiodorus, a 6th century statesman who retired to a monastery and encouraged the copying of texts. His efforts preserved Cicero, Virgil, and other Roman authors who might otherwise have vanished. If even a portion of those manuscripts was sent to Rome, the Vatican could hold versions far older and more accurate than those known today. Some scholars believe that uncatalogued manuscripts of this kind still rest in the archives, waiting to be rediscovered. The Dark Ages narrative also overlooks the vibrancy of the Byzantine Empire, where scholars continue to copy and comment on ancient Greek works. During moments of alliance or tension, Byzantine emperors sent documents to Rome, sometimes as gifts, sometimes as bargaining tools. A hypothesis suggests that certain Byzantine codices, covering astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, were transferred into papal custody during these exchanges. If so, the archives might preserve a lineage of knowledge uninterrupted by the so-called darkness. Yet there are stranger whispers too. Some claim that the Vatican holds manuscripts describing technologies that flourished in secret during this era. Mechanical devices, hydraulic systems, even rudimentary clocks centuries before such inventions were widely known. Historians are still debating whether these claims reflect genuine lost knowledge or the embellishments of romantic imagination. A peculiar story from the 13th century describes a monk in England who constructed a flying machine, only to have his work condemned by church officials. The record, if genuine, may have been preserved in Rome, where documents on heresy and forbidden invention were often sent. The Carolingian Renaissance under Charlemagne offers another focal point. In the 8th and 9th centuries, scholars gathered at his court to revive learning. They copied texts, reformed writing, and sought wisdom from across Europe. Many of their manuscripts survived in cathedral schools and eventually entered church repositories. But some accounts suggest that Charlemagne also sent rare pagan texts to Rome for safekeeping, fearing their contents might confuse his subjects. If true, such works might still lie hidden. The hypothesis that the Dark Ages were less dark than claimed has gained strength in recent decades. Archaeology reveals that trade networks persisted, that craftsmanship flourished, and that ideas moved across Europe and the Mediterranean more freely than once assumed. Yet, if the Vatican possesses documents showing uninterrupted chains of learning, why were they not released? Some argue it was a matter of control. By presenting the Renaissance as a rebirth from darkness, the Church emphasized its role as the guiding light of civilization. To acknowledge a continuous thread of learning might weaken that narrative. Strange and off-topic tales add further layers. In the 17th century, a Jesuit in China reported finding ancient records describing contact between eastern and western lands long before Marco Polo. These reports, he wrote, were sent to Rome. If they still exist, they would collapse the idea of isolation in the early medieval world, showing instead a web of cultural contact stretching back centuries. The archives may also contain chronicles of natural disasters that shaped the medieval imagination. Accounts of the volcanic winter of 536 CE, when the sun dimmed and harvest failed, survive in scattered sources. Procopius of Byzantium described the darkened skies, while Irish annals record famine and plague. If the Vatican holds additional eyewitness testimonies, they could illuminate how widespread the disaster truly was, and whether it inspired the apocalyptic tone of early medieval faith. Historians are still debating whether the darkness was one of ignorance or simply of perception. By labeling centuries as dark, later generations created a foil against which their own achievements shone more brightly. The archives, if opened, might dispel this illusion, showing that knowledge was preserved, adapted, and sometimes even advanced during those turbulent years. The Vatican's role in this story is ambiguous. Was it the guardian of continuity, preserving fragile manuscripts until Europe was ready to study them again? Or was it a gatekeeper, deciding which truths would see daylight and which would remain sealed away? The answer may lie in the dust-covered shelves of the archives, where parchments from the so-called Dark Ages rest silently, awaiting rediscovery. In the end, the Dark Ages may not have been dark at all, but dimly lit corridors where knowledge survived quietly, hidden from the storms of history. Whether by accident or by design, the Vatican's archives may hold the lamp that proves the shadows were never as deep as we imagined. Beyond questions of hidden gospels and forgotten catastrophes lies another dimension of the Vatican's archives, their role as instruments of political power. From the moment Pope Paul V ordered their consolidation in the 17th century, the archives became more than a repository of history. They became a lever of influence, a way for the Church to negotiate, control, and outlast monarchs and emperors. To understand what might lie inside, one must consider not only what the archives preserve, but why the Church collected such materials in the first place. Throughout the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, the papacy stood at the crossroads of European politics. Kings sought papal approval to legitimize their reigns. Queens wrote for annulments, treaties, and blessings. Crusaders needed papal bulls to justify expeditions, and rulers petitioned for recognition of their dynasties. Every such transaction generated documents, decrees, letters, agreements, and compromises. These were stored in Rome, often in duplicates, creating a parallel record of Europe's statecraft. One authoritative example is the correspondence between Pope Clement VII and King Henry VIII of England. When Henry sought annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Clement's refusal set in motion the English Reformation. The letters, preserved in the Vatican, record not only theological arguments, but also the personal, political, and dynastic pressures at play. They reveal how the decision to deny Henry, while devastating to the unity of Christendom, was also a calculation shaped by alliances with Spain. That such correspondence survives underscores the Vatican's role as both participant and chronicler of European power struggles. Historians are still debating whether the Church acted primarily as a neutral arbiter or as a self-interested power. The archives, locked away, hold the evidence. Treaties negotiated behind closed doors, concessions extracted by popes, and letters from monarchs who sought absolution for brutal campaigns. To release such documents openly could embarrass dynasties or reveal the Church's complicity in questionable acts. The archives also contain the agreements that carved up continents. The Treaty of Tordesillas, preserved there, split the New World between Spain and Portugal in 1494 under papal sanction. Yet alongside such famous treaties must be lesser-known arrangements, letters promising lands, dividing spoils, or granting rights to missionaries. Some scholars suggest that the archives conceal agreements never revealed to the public, including secret pacts with explorers or concessions to colonial powers. These documents could explain why certain empires flourished while others faltered, showing how papal approval shaped the course of global history. Beyond Europe, rulers of distant lands also corresponded with Rome. Ethiopian emperors, Mongol khans, and Japanese daimyos sent envoys bearing letters and gifts. Some sought alliances, others religious recognition. These interactions, often overshadowed in mainstream history, may still be preserved in the Vatican. If so, they reveal a network of diplomacy stretching across continents, challenging the notion that Europe was isolated from the wider world before modern globalization. A strange and off-topic episode illustrates the archive's political role. In the 16th century, rumors spread that the Vatican possessed letters from Christopher Columbus describing lands and peoples he did not publicly disclose. According to the tale, these letters mentioned gold, strange temples, and unusual constellations. While historians doubt the accuracy of such claims, The possibility that papal approval of Columbus's voyages was tied to confidential reports reflects how exploration and secrecy were often entwined. The archives also contain records of inquisitions, those grim tribunals that judged heresy. Far from being purely theological, these trials often had political dimensions. Monarchs could use accusations of heresy to silence rivals or consolidate power, while the Church could exert control by determining who was orthodox. The testimonies, confessions, and verdicts, preserved on parchment, show the intertwining of faith and politics. Many historians believe that the Vatican's refusal to release some inquisitorial records stems from the fact that they reveal uncomfortable truths about the use of religion as a political weapon. One hypothesis suggests that the Vatican deliberately cultivated its role as Europe's secret keeper. By holding the most sensitive documents, it ensured that monarchs had reason to treat it with respect. A pope who could reveal a king's private confessions, expose a treaty made in bad faith, or uncover correspondence with enemies held leverage over that ruler. The archives thus became less a library and more a treasury of influence, carefully guarded and used when necessary. An authoritative parallel can be drawn to medieval monasteries, which often served as archives for kings. Charters and deeds were deposited with monks to ensure their safekeeping. The Vatican simply extended this practice to a global scale, becoming the ultimate archive of Christendom. Yet unlike monasteries, the Vatican had no obligation to release its holdings to the public. It could choose silence, wielding knowledge as quiet power. Historians are still debating how much of Europe's political history lies hidden in the Vatican. Some argue that most sensitive documents were lost in wars or stolen by rival states. Others insist that the archives, with their kilometers of shelving, almost certainly contain letters and agreements never seen outside Rome. What is undeniable is that rulers trusted the papacy to keep their secrets, and that secrecy remains intact. The archive's political dimension also raises broader questions. If the Vatican holds documents proving collusion, corruption, or conquest, what responsibility does it bear to release them? Does the preservation of history outweigh the risk of destabilizing modern nations? Or is silence itself a kind of guardianship, preventing old wounds from reopening? The Church's decision to keep its most sensitive holdings closed ensures that such debates remain alive. The power of the Vatican's archives is therefore not only in what they contain but in what they withhold. They are a reminder that knowledge and politics are inseparable, and that history is not just what is remembered, but also what is concealed. The dusty shelves of Rome may hold not only the forgotten Gospels and ancient catastrophes, but also the secret contracts that shaped kingdoms and empires. In those pages lies a hidden history of power, one the world may never fully see. As centuries of diplomacy and politics flowed into the Vatican's vaults, another kind of record began to accumulate: manuscripts and codices associated with magic, heresy, and the occult. These were not the respectable documents of kings and treaties, but the dangerous writings of mystics, visionaries, and accused sorcerers. In the eyes of the Church, such works threatened the unity of faith, for they blended Christian symbols with pagan rituals or proposed knowledge that bypassed priestly authority. Yet instead of destroying all these texts outright, the Vatican often preserved them, locking them away as evidence, or as warnings, of the ideas it sought to suppress. The Middle Ages were an age of fervent belief, but also of deep fear. Demons, witches, and unseen forces haunted the imagination. Manuals of exorcism circulated, some sanctioned by the Church, others condemned as heretical. Whispered charms were written on scraps of parchment, while grimoires, the so-called black books of magic, compiled elaborate rituals for summoning angels or spirits. Historians are still debating how widespread such practices truly were. But the records of inquisitions reveal countless cases in which accused heretics confessed to owning forbidden texts. Many of those books confiscated in trials were sent to Rome. What became of them afterward is less certain. One authoritative example is the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, published in the 15th century. This book, ironically sanctioned by church officials, became a manual for identifying and persecuting witches. Yet alongside such sanctioned works were others condemned for granting too much power to the individual. Some manuscripts describe the use of herbs and symbols for healing, blurring the line between medicine and magic. Others blended astrology with prophecy, suggesting that the stars, not just God, shaped human fate. If copies survived inquisitorial destruction, they may rest even now in the Vatican's vaults. The hypothesis that the Vatican stores grimoires is strengthened by the Church's long habit of preserving what it condemned. To refute heresy, one must study it. To warn against sorcery, one must understand its texts. Scholars point to inquisitorial manuals that specifically mention collecting confiscated books. If true, the Vatican's archives may contain a hidden library of magical literature, a shadow canon reflecting humanity's forbidden experiments with the supernatural. Stranger still are rumors of codices that blur the boundary between theology and sorcery. Some claim that the archives house manuscripts written by medieval alchemists, who merged chemical experiments with invocations of angels. Others whisper of the Book of Solomon, a legendary text of incantations said to summon spirits to build a temple. Versions of this text exist in occult traditions, but could the Vatican possess an older, more authoritative manuscript, perhaps obtained from Jewish communities or crusaders in the Holy Land? Historians are still debating whether such tales are exaggerations, yet the persistence of the rumors is telling. A peculiar story arises from the 16th century, when Spanish inquisitors confiscated texts from accused mystics in Toledo. One manuscript reportedly described methods of seeing the future by the stars and the blood of birds. According to an antiquarian writing centuries later, this work was forwarded to Rome and placed in the archives, though it was never again seen by scholars. Whether true or not, it illustrates how easily fragments of the occult might have entered the Vatican's custody. Another off-topic but revealing tale comes from Iceland, where bishops reported in the 17th century that grimoires known as black books circulated widely. When confiscated, some were destroyed, but others were supposedly sent abroad for examination. Legends claim a few reached Rome, where they were hidden away to keep their dangerous contents from spreading. These Icelandic texts combined Christian prayers with runic spells, a blend of faith and folklore that defied simple categorization. The existence of magical manuscripts in the archives would not only illuminate Europe's past but also its anxieties. They would show how deeply people feared the unknown and how strongly they sought to control it through ritual. They might reveal lust, traditions of healing, knowledge of herbs, or systems of divination that have since vanished. They would also demonstrate the Church's double role as persecutor of magic, yet also as its secret archivist. Historians are still debating whether the Vatican suppressed these writings to protect believers from dangerous ideas, or whether it deliberately hoarded them as a means of controlling knowledge. Some argue that the Church feared chaos if such texts spread. Others believe that possession of these manuscripts gave the Vatican a monopoly on forbidden wisdom. Either way, the archives became not just a vault of theology, but a prison for ideas judged too volatile for the world outside. The Index of Forbidden Books provides context here. While best known for banning scientific and philosophical works, it also listed mystical and magical texts. Yet again, the question arises, what happened to the actual copies? Were they burned or filed away? The Vatican's reluctance to answer this question fuels speculation. The codices of magic and heresy remind us that history is not only the story of kings and councils, but also of those who lived at the margins, visionaries, healers, and accused witches whose voices were often silenced. If their manuscripts survive in Rome, then the archives hold not only the official story of Christendom, but also its hidden counter-narrative, the suppressed chorus of those who dared to think differently. Perhaps in the stillness of the Vatican's underground halls, pages describing ancient rituals still lie bound in cracked leather. Whether they are preserved as cautionary relics or as unacknowledged reservoirs of human imagination, they remain locked away, silent witnesses to humanity's unending fascination with forbidden knowledge. Among the many categories of documents rumored to rest within the Vatican's sealed halls, few stir more curiosity than the letters and journals of explorers. For centuries, missionaries, crusaders, and merchants ventured into lands unknown to Europe, often under papal blessing. Their words, descriptions of new worlds, strange peoples, and unfamiliar faiths, were sometimes shared with the public, but just as often sent directly to Rome. The archives thus became a receptacle not only of theology, but of geography, preserving first-hand accounts of journeys that may have rewritten maps long before the age of discovery. During the medieval era, exploration was often a blend of pilgrimage, conquest, and curiosity. Crusaders carried home tales of distant fortresses and exotic spices. Merchants described routes through Asia. Pilgrims to the Holy Land recorded landscapes, relics, and encounters with cultures vastly different from their own. Many of these accounts were copied and stored in monasteries, but those bearing political or religious significance often ended up in Rome. If so, the Vatican's vaults may contain manuscripts describing lands that vanished from memory, or that Europe only rediscovered centuries later. An authoritative example is the correspondence of the Knights Templar. This powerful military order, active during the Crusades, maintained vast networks of property and information. When the Templars were suppressed in the early 14th century, their records were seized by both monarchs and the papacy. Some survive in public archives, but others likely vanished into the Vatican. Historians are still debating whether among them were maps and descriptions of routes to the east, or even across the Atlantic, recorded by sailors who may have ventured farther than the official histories admit. The Jesuits, too, were prolific correspondents. Sent as missionaries across Asia, Africa, and the Americas, they described everything from Chinese astronomy to Brazilian flora. Many of their letters were published in Europe, fueling curiosity and sometimes controversy. Yet not all correspondence was released. Some, containing sensitive cultural or political observations, may have been stored away. If the Vatican preserved these hidden reports, they could offer extraordinary insights into how early Europeans viewed civilizations like the Ming Dynasty or the Aztec Empire, without the filter of later propaganda. One hypothesis claims that long before Columbus, papal envoys had heard of lands across the ocean. Norse sagas tell of Vinland, a fertile shore visited by Leif Erikson around the year 1000. Medieval maps, such as the Vinland map, though disputed, suggest that knowledge of Western lands may have circulated. If missionaries or traders brought such stories to Rome, they may have been recorded and hidden, lest they complicate the later narrative of discovery as a uniquely Catholic triumph. A peculiar and often repeated tale comes from the 13th century. It concerns a letter known as the Epistle of Prester John, purportedly written by a Christian king ruling a vast kingdom somewhere in Asia or Africa. This letter described rivers of jewels, fantastical creatures, and immense armies. Though now seen as mythical, copies of the letter circulated widely, inspiring explorers to search for this hidden kingdom. Some versions were addressed directly to the Pope. Could the Vatican preserve earlier, less embellished drafts, perhaps pointing to a real kingdom behind the myth? Historians are still debating whether Prester John was fantasy, a distorted account of Ethiopia, or evidence of forgotten Christian enclaves. Another strange story surfaces in the 16th century, when Portuguese sailors returned from the Indian Ocean with reports of ruins along the African coast, stone cities unlike anything they expected. Some of their letters were forwarded to Rome. Modern archaeology has since confirmed the existence of Great Zimbabwe, a monumental city once dismissed by colonial scholars as too advanced to have been built by Africans. If the Vatican holds early accounts of this city, they could reveal not only lost knowledge but also the biases that shaped Europe's view of the wider world. Explorers also carried religious artifacts and texts. Jesuits in South America collected native codices, some of which were condemned as pagan. While many were burned, rumors persist that certain manuscripts were preserved in Rome, locked away rather than destroyed. If true, the Vatican may house unique records of pre-Columbian civilizations, their myths and histories otherwise erased. Such documents would be invaluable, offering voices silenced by conquest. One off-topic yet intriguing episode involves a Venetian merchant who claimed to have sailed down the coast of Africa in the 14th century, reaching lands far beyond the maps of his time. According to later retellings, his journals were confiscated by church officials and placed in the archives. Whether this was invention or fact, it reflects the persistent suspicion that knowledge of the world was broader than the official record allowed. Historians are still debating how much of Europe's age of discovery was truly discovery, and how much was rediscovery. The Vatican's archives, if opened, could answer this by showing whether maps and letters described the Americas, Africa, or Asia, centuries before Columbus and Vasco da Gama. Such revelations would not only reshape history, but also expose how narratives of exploration were crafted to serve political ends. The letters of exploration remind us that knowledge is never neutral. Every description of distant lands carried implications for trade, faith, and conquest. The Vatican's decision to preserve or suppress such accounts may have shaped not only theology, but also geography. Perhaps within those sealed shelves lie maps of rivers unknown, letters from kings forgotten, and journals describing stars from hemispheres unseen. If so, they would prove that the world was larger in human memory than we have long believed. And so, the archives may hold not only the chronicles of Europe, but also the echoes of lands far beyond it, a hidden atlas of humanity's restless urge to wander, and the silences imposed upon those wanderings when they did not fit the sanctioned story. Exploration, politics, and theology each find their place in the Vatican's vaults. But some of the most persistent and unsettling rumors concern manuscripts that describe encounters with the otherworldly. These are not simply reports of distant kings or hidden lands, but accounts of visions, apparitions, and phenomena that resist easy classification. For centuries, the Church has been the custodian of miracles, apparitions, and celestial signs, tasked with discerning what was divine and what was deception. If the archives preserve the raw records of these investigations, they may also contain descriptions of events that defy explanation. Episodes interpreted in earlier times as angelic or demonic, but which modern minds might describe in entirely different terms. Throughout medieval Europe, people believed the heavens were alive with meaning. Comets were harbingers of doom, eclipses warnings of divine wrath, and strange lights in the sky evidence of celestial intervention. Chroniclers dutifully recorded such events, often sending reports to Rome for verification. Some of these chronicles survive openly, but others are rumored to be hidden in the archives. Historians are still debating whether the Vatican suppressed them because they threatened doctrine, or whether they were simply too strange to categorize. One authoritative example comes from the year 1561, when citizens of Nuremberg reported seeing shapes in the sky, crosses, spheres, and cylinders battling above the city. Pamphlets describe the spectacle in detail, while modern interpretations range from atmospheric phenomena to early descriptions of unidentified flying objects. The Church treated it as a potential sign from heaven. Copies of the reports were said to have been sent to Rome. If preserved, they would illustrate how seriously the Vatican took such accounts and how carefully they chose which to circulate. Other reports were more personal. Mystics claimed visions of angels bearing messages. Some described encounters with beings whose appearance did not conform to Christian iconography. These testimonies, collected by inquisitors, were often locked away after the individuals were condemned. Did the Vatican preserve them not out of belief but out of caution, ensuring that future generations could study the case files? If so, they may contain some of the most peculiar descriptions of the supernatural ever recorded. Hypothesis that the Vatican possesses records of alien encounters is fueled by the language of these old reports. What a medieval scribe called a chariot of fire, a modern reader might see as a craft of unknown origin. Lights described as stars that moved erratically may sound to contemporary ears like unidentified aerial phenomena. Of course, historians caution against anachronism. Symbols and metaphors of the past do not always align with modern categories. Still, the persistence of such stories raises questions. A peculiar story from the 16th century illustrates the ambiguity. A Spanish missionary in the New World wrote of a group of natives who claimed their ancestors had been visited by beings clothed in shining skin, descending with thunder. The missionary recorded the tale skeptically, yet he included enough detail to unsettle modern readers. According to some accounts, his report was forwarded to Rome and then quietly shelved. Historians are still debating whether the Vatican would have considered such material folklore, heresy, or dangerous truth. Even stranger are accounts linked to the Fatima apparitions of 1917. 3 children in Portugal reported visions of a radiant figure, later interpreted as the Virgin Mary. Their testimonies, including the so-called Third Secret of Fatima, were preserved by the Church and kept confidential for decades. When portions were finally released in 2000, they spoke of visions of persecution and suffering. But some critics argue that not all the material was revealed, suggesting that even in modern times the Vatican maintains its tradition of partial disclosure. If this is true of Fatima, how many older apparitions remain hidden in its vaults? One off-topic but related story involves the medieval fascination with giants. Chronicles from Ireland, Scandinavia, and even Italy describe enormous skeletons unearthed in the earth. Often dismissed as exaggerations, these reports sometimes reached Rome, where clerics debated whether they proved the existence of biblical Nephilim. If records of these skeletons survive in the Vatican, they may show how earnestly earlier generations sought to reconcile myth with evidence. The archives may also contain correspondences about celestial anomalies observed by astronomers. Jesuit missionaries in China collaborated with local scholars, recording eclipses, comets, and unusual lights. Some of their letters were published, but others may have been considered too unconventional. If hidden away, they could reveal centuries of observations of phenomena still not fully explained. Historians are still debating whether these accounts reflect real events or the imaginative symbolism of the past. Yet even if symbolic, they reveal how deeply humans have always looked upward and wondered. The Vatican, as guardian of both theology and curiosity, gathered these stories, judged them, and then locked many away. The possibility that the archives contain testimonies of the otherworldly, whether angels, demons, or something entirely beyond, reminds us of the delicate balance between faith and fear. For the Church, acknowledging too much could blur the line between miracle and heresy. For modern readers, however, these same accounts might suggest that humanity has always been encountering mysteries it cannot fully explain. In the silence of the Vatican's shelves may lie manuscripts describing skies ablaze, beings clothed in light, and voices from beyond. Whether interpreted as divine revelation, demonic illusion, or encounters with something altogether other, they remain part of the hidden record of humanity's search for meaning in a vast, mysterious universe. The archives do not merely whisper of ancient catastrophes, lost civilizations, or the mysteries of the heavens. They also record the more tangible collisions between science and faith. Few episodes capture this tension more clearly than the case of Galileo Galilei. His trial in 1633 has become one of the most emblematic moments in the history of science, a symbol of how new knowledge can threaten established authority. The Vatican's archives contain transcripts of the proceedings, letters from Galileo himself, and testimonies of the theologians who judged him. Yet beyond what has been published, many believe that other documents remain sealed, perhaps revealing a more complex relationship between the Church and science, and the simplified narrative of suppression. Galileo had dared to champion the heliocentric model of the cosmos, building on the work of Copernicus. With his telescope he observed moons orbiting Jupiter, phases of Venus, and mountains on the moon. Observations that undermine the geocentric model, which placed Earth immovably at the center. His discoveries inspired awe, but also provoked alarm. If the heavens were not fixed and perfect, as Aristotle had taught and the Church had long affirmed, then what else might be open to question? Historians are still debating whether Galileo's condemnation stemmed primarily from theology, from politics, or from Galileo's own defiant personality. What is clear is that he was compelled to recant and spent the remainder of his life under house arrest. The transcripts of his trial, preserved in the archives, reveal both the theological concerns and the behind-the-scenes maneuvering. But some speculate that more remains hidden. Perhaps notes from cardinals who supported Galileo, or even copies of astronomical manuscripts too dangerous to release. An authoritative reference lies in the fact that the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of forbidden books, included not only Galileo's works, but also those of Copernicus. For centuries these texts were restricted, yet the Vatican preserved copies. This dual role, banning publicly while preserving privately, suggests a deliberate policy. The Church did not wish to lose knowledge, but neither did it wish to admit its authority could be challenged. The hypothesis that additional documents remain locked away gains strength when one considers how carefully the Vatican managed the Galileo affair in later centuries. In 1992, Pope John Paul II formally acknowledged the Church's error in condemning Galileo, drawing on a commission that had reviewed archival materials. Yet the commission's report did not release everything. Some scholars believe certain notes were withheld, either to protect reputations or to avoid fueling conspiracy theories. The possibility lingers that the archives still shelter correspondence, revealing that Church officials privately accepted Galileo's findings, even while condemning him publicly. Beyond Galileo, the archives may hold evidence of other censored scientific discoveries. In the 17th century, Jesuit astronomers in China made detailed observations of celestial events, often collaborating with local scholars. Some of their letters, describing eclipses and comets, reached Rome. Could they have included data pointing to phenomena unexplained by the cosmology of the time? If so, such records might still lie in the Vatican's vaults, hidden alongside Galileo's trial documents. Stranger rumors circulate as well. In the 19th century, an Italian historian claimed that the Vatican possessed manuscripts describing telescopic observations of Saturn's rings long before Galileo. These accounts, he said, were suppressed to preserve the image of the Church as the sole arbiter of truth. No evidence supports his claim, yet the very suggestion reveals how the archive's secrecy invites speculation that science advanced faster than we are told, only to be slowed by deliberate silence. One peculiar off-topic story concerns the trial of Giordano Bruno, who was executed in 1600 for heresy. Bruno's ideas went far beyond Copernicus. He argued that the universe was infinite and that other worlds might be inhabited. While official records of his trial survive, some believe that transcripts in the Vatican archives contain more explicit statements about his cosmology. If revealed, they would show that concepts of infinite universes and extraterrestrial life were debated centuries before modern astronomy. Historians are still debating whether the Vatican has deliberately withheld these documents, fearing their resonance in an age of renewed interest in extraterrestrial possibility. The Galileo affair reminds us that the archives are not neutral. They're not only a record of what was said, but of what was silenced. They preserve the tension between curiosity and control, between revelation and restriction. In their shelves, science and faith confront one another in a fragile balance. The Church may have condemned heliocentrism, but by preserving Galileo's manuscripts it also ensured that future generations could rediscover them. This duality, suppressing while preserving, defines much of the Vatican's relationship with science. It suggests that the archives may hold not only documents that challenge doctrine, but also evidence of a quiet respect for knowledge, even knowledge deemed dangerous. The question is whether humanity will ever see the full record, or whether it will remain sealed, a testimony to centuries of conflict between light and shadow. In the story of Galileo, the Vatican's archives serve as both prison and sanctuary for ideas. They remind us that history is not merely written by the victors, but also stored by those who would prefer it remain unread. The trial transcripts already known to us reveal much, but the possibility of hidden notes, suppressed observations, and forgotten manuscripts ensures that the Galileo affair continues to echo through the corridors of the Vatican, as alive in mystery now as it was nearly 4 centuries ago. From Galileo's trial and the whispers of forbidden science, the story turns to a broader apparatus of censorship that shaped knowledge for centuries: the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books. First issued in 1559, during the height of the Counter-Reformation, the index catalogued works deemed heretical, dangerous, or morally corrupt. For nearly 4 centuries, it stood as one of the most powerful instruments of intellectual control in Europe. Books by philosophers, scientists, and poets were listed side by side with theological treatises that challenged orthodoxy. The Vatican ordered that Catholics were not to read or possess them, and yet the paradox remains: if these books were forbidden, what happened to their copies? Were they destroyed? Or, as many suspect, were they quietly preserved, hidden deep in the archives? The index reflects both fear and fascination. To ban a book acknowledges its influence. The earliest lists included works by Martin Luther and other reformers whose theological tracts challenged papal authority. Over time, the index expanded to include writings by Descartes, Pascal, Rousseau, Kant, and even some by Erasmus, once hailed as the Prince of Humanists. Galileo's works appeared as well, ensuring that scientific knowledge and philosophical reasoning were judged alongside theological dissent. The forbidden text represented not only opposition, but also possibility, glimpses of worlds of thought the Church sought to contain. Historians are still debating whether the Vatican's true goal was suppression or preservation. Some argue that the index was intended merely to guide the faithful, not to annihilate knowledge. Others counter that the act of forbidding inevitably restricted circulation and stifled ideas. What complicates the picture is that the Church itself needed access to these works in order to critique them. This meant that copies had to be preserved somewhere. The logical place for them was the archives. One authoritative clue lies in the existence of the so-called Bibliotheca Secreta, a secret library within the Vatican, where prohibited texts were reportedly kept for consultation by approved scholars. Records from the 17th century mention such collections, suggesting that rather than burn dangerous works, the Church stored them under lock and key. If this practice continued, the archives could now contain vast numbers of books by authors once silenced, from Enlightenment thinkers to revolutionary pamphleteers. The peculiar episode occurred in the late 19th century, when a French visitor claimed to have seen a Vatican shelf containing banned novels by Voltaire. He described them as annotated in the margins by clerics who had carefully dissected their arguments. Whether his account was accurate or exaggerated remains unclear. But the idea that the Vatican not only kept such works but actively studied them raises questions about the line between censorship and scholarship. Stranger still are rumors that the Vatican preserved even the most esoteric and controversial writings. Some suggest that alchemical treatises, occult grimoires, and mystical commentaries on the Kabbalah, all placed on the index, were not destroyed but shelved in the archives. The very texts condemned in public may have been scrutinized in private, forming a hidden mirror of the intellectual history of Europe. The hypothesis of preservation grows stronger when considering the end of the index itself. Officially abolished in 1966 by Pope Paul VI, the index no longer binds Catholics under penalty of sin, yet its legacy remains. Generations of forbidden texts accumulated under its watch. If even a fraction of them was stored in the Vatican, the archives could house an unparalleled library of suppressed knowledge, works that shaped revolutions, scientific revolts, and philosophical upheavals. Historians are still debating the Vatican's motives for finally ending the index. Some argue that it reflected a recognition of modern freedom of thought. Others believe it acknowledged the impossibility of controlling information in an age of mass printing. Either way, the centuries of accumulated censorship left behind a residue of secrecy. The books were not suddenly destroyed in 1966. Most likely they remained where they had long been kept, on hidden shelves, accessible only to those permitted by papal decree. One off-topic but telling anecdote involves the case of Giacomo Casanova, the Venetian adventurer whose scandalous memoirs and philosophical writings landed him on the index. It is said that when a Vatican scholar mentioned seeing his works in Rome, he joked that even forbidden libertines must be preserved for history. The remark, though light-hearted, illustrates the deeper paradox of the archives. What is condemned may also be treasured. The Index of Forbidden Books thus symbolizes the dual nature of the Vatican's archives. They are both jailer and guardian. They condemn knowledge in public while preserving it in private. They shape the story of what humanity may read while secretly keeping the pages of what it must forget. Whether those shelves still hold the voices of silenced philosophers, scientists, and poets, no outsider can say. But the possibility ensures that the Vatican's silence will always echo louder than its proclamations. In the end, the index reminds us that history is not only written by the winners, but also stored by them. The forbidden texts may remain intact, waiting for some distant day when the locks are opened, and the voices of centuries past are finally heard. Until then, they rest as shadows in the Vatican's vaults, books whose very suppression has ensured their enduring allure. Beyond the broad categories of hidden gospels, forbidden sciences, and censored books, lies an even subtler form of concealment, the art of codes and ciphers. For centuries, communication between rulers, cardinals, and popes traveled across dangerous roads and hostile borders. Letters carried secrets of war, alliances, and betrayals. To protect them, writers developed intricate systems of encryption, hidden alphabets, reversed letters, and elaborate substitution schemes. Many of these encrypted manuscripts survive, and some are rumored to lie deep in the Vatican's archives, still undeciphered, waiting for a patient reader who might reveal their secrets. The use of ciphers in church affairs is well attested. During the Renaissance, when politics and intrigue swirled across Italian city-states, the papal court relied heavily on cryptography. One authoritative example is the work of Johannes Trithemius, a German abbot who in the early 16th century wrote Steganographia, a book blending cryptographic techniques with angelic invocations. Though later scholars recognized its hidden codes, contemporaries believed it a book of magic and sought to ban it. Copies were confiscated and condemned. If any survived in papal custody, they may now be preserved in the Vatican's secret collections. Historians are still debating how widely such codes were used to disguise political dealings. Some argue that the papacy, as a central player in European power struggles, depended on cryptography more than any monarchy. Letters between popes and ambassadors often appear in code, and some have been cracked only in recent centuries. Yet many remain unreadable, sitting in archives as strings of symbols and numbers, their meanings lost with the keys. The hypothesis that the Vatican contains a wealth of undeciphered manuscripts is supported by known discoveries. In 2011, researchers revealed a ciphered letter from Mary, Queen of Scots, written to her allies while imprisoned. The letter had been hidden in archives for centuries, misfiled. Once decoded, it provided new insight into her desperate attempts to regain her throne. If such treasures can surface from state archives, how many more might await within the Vatican? One peculiar story involves a set of letters attributed to the papal nuncio in France during the Wars of Religion. According to a 19th century scholar, these letters were written entirely in symbols resembling alchemical sigils. He claimed to have seen copies in Rome but admitted he could not decipher them. Whether these were political ciphers or genuinely esoteric writings remains unresolved. Historians are still debating whether this account was exaggerated or reflects a hidden cache of encoded correspondence. Stranger still are rumors of cipher gospels preserved in the archives, texts of Christian teaching written in code, allegedly to protect secret doctrines from persecution. While no such documents have ever been verified, the idea persists in fringe scholarship fueled by the Vatican's silence. Some claim these texts describe hidden sayings of Jesus or mystical cosmologies suppressed by later councils. If they exist, they would represent not just coded communication but coded theology, a parallel tradition buried in symbols. The Renaissance fascination with secret writing produced many such artifacts. Giovanni Battista della Porta, an Italian polymath, described ciphers in his work, De Furtivis Literarum Notis. His methods influenced diplomats across Europe. It is plausible that Rome, as the hub of such exchanges, preserved not only his works but also the encoded letters themselves. To this day, scholars encounter manuscripts in the Vatican's catalogue labeled only as indeciphered text. Their contents remain unknown. A peculiar off-topic anecdote concerns the so-called Voynich manuscript, an illustrated codex written in an unknown script, discovered in the early 20th century and now housed at Yale University. While not a Vatican artifact, some researchers suggest it may have passed through Rome in earlier centuries, examined and then dismissed as gibberish. The Vatican, according to this theory, retained other similar works, too obscure or too dangerous to release. Historians are still debating whether such manuscripts represent lost languages, secret codes, or elaborate hoaxes. The importance of codes and ciphers in the archives is not purely academic. They remind us that much of history was written in secrecy, intended only for select eyes. The very act of encrypting knowledge reveals both its value and its danger. What lies hidden in those pages may be mundane, records of trade or political maneuvering, or it may be explosive, accounts of betrayals, confessions of faithless rulers, or evidence of heresies at the heart of power. The Vatican's decision to preserve these manuscripts rather than discard them reflects its role as custodian not only of theology, but of secrecy itself. In a sense, the archives are one vast cipher, a system of locks and keys deciding who may know and who may remain in ignorance. Historians are still debating whether the Church will ever open these ciphered manuscripts to broader study. Some argue that advances in digital analysis could decode them, shedding light on centuries of hidden communication. Others believe the Vatican has no incentive to release materials that might embarrass states or expose uncomfortable truths. Whatever the case, the shelves of Rome almost certainly hold letters and codices whose true words remain unseen. They are the whispers of history written in symbols, messages passed across centuries from voices now silent. To decipher them would be to give those voices speech again. Until then, they remain locked in cipher, as mysterious as the archives themselves. The Vatican's vaults, though often imagined as purely religious repositories, also reflect the entanglement of church and empire. For centuries, popes negotiated with monarchs, emperors, and conquerors, shaping the fate of continents. Treaties were signed under papal authority, colonial charters were issued with papal blessing, and delicate correspondences between missionaries and rulers were carried to Rome. If the archives contain the true record of these exchanges, then they preserve not only ecclesiastical history, but the hidden architecture of global empires. From the 15th century onward, the papacy stood at the center of exploration and colonization. In 1493, Pope Alexander VI issued the Inter Caetera Bull, granting Spain rights over newly discovered lands in the Americas. A year later, the Treaty of Tordesillas divided the world between Spain and Portugal along a line in the Atlantic. These documents survive openly, but the negotiations behind them, the letters, drafts, and private concessions, are far less visible. Historians are still debating whether these materials remain sealed in the archives, hidden because they expose how arbitrary and self-serving the division of the world truly was. An authoritative example of the Vatican's influence is seen in its relationship with the Portuguese Empire. Jesuit missionaries reported not only on faith but also on resources, trade routes, and local politics in Asia and Africa. Their letters shaped colonial policies, advising kings on how to govern vast territories. Many of these reports reached Rome, where they were studied by papal officials. If preserved, they could reveal a parallel history of empire, one written by priests and missionaries, not monarchs. The hypothesis that the Vatican holds secret colonial documents is supported by curious silences in historical records. For instance, little survives of the private communications between the papacy and Spanish officials during the conquest of the Americas. Did missionaries report the brutal treatment of indigenous peoples? Did papal envoys protest the enslavement and massacres carried out in the name of empire? Some fragments suggest they did. Bartolomé de las Casas, a Dominican friar, famously denounced Spanish cruelty. His petitions to the crown are preserved. But what of the letters sent to Rome? If they lie in the archives, they could reveal the Church's full awareness of colonial atrocities and its choice to act or remain silent. Stranger still are rumors that the archives preserve maps of lands never officially acknowledged. Some suggest that Portuguese sailors reached Australia decades before Dutch explorers, and that Jesuit correspondents relayed this to Rome. Others claim that missionaries in the Pacific recorded islands long before they appeared on European charts. Whether these claims are fact or fantasy, the archive's role as a repository of colonial reports makes them plausible. A peculiar and often overlooked story comes from Ethiopia. In the 17th century, Catholic missionaries attempted to convert the Ethiopian Church to Roman obedience. During this period, Ethiopian rulers sent letters and chronicles to the papacy. Some described their ancient Christian traditions, tracing lineage back to the Queen of Sheba. These texts largely disappeared from public view. Historians are still debating whether the Vatican absorbed them, storing accounts that could expand our understanding of African Christianity's antiquity. Beyond colonialism, the archives also preserve documents of empire within Europe. Concordats, agreements between popes and rulers, determined the balance of power between church and state. One striking example is the Concordat of Worms in 1122, which ended the investiture controversy over who could appoint bishops. Records of such negotiations remain in the Vatican, illustrating how deeply the papacy shaped medieval politics. Yet drafts and secret clauses may never have been released, leaving historians to wonder how many hidden compromises were struck behind closed doors. One off-topic but intriguing anecdote involves Napoleon's invasion of Rome in 1810. French troops reportedly seized trunks of Vatican documents and shipped them to Paris. After Napoleon's fall, some were returned, but others vanished. Among them were said to be colonial records and maps. A few resurface occasionally in French collections, but the majority remain unaccounted for. Some scholars speculate that Rome quietly reabsorbed them, while others believe they were destroyed. The uncertainty only deepens the aura surrounding the archives. The archive's connection to empire extends even into modern times. During the Second World War, correspondence between the Vatican and Axis or Allied leaders was carefully guarded. Debates over the Church's response to the Holocaust continue, with researchers calling for greater access to wartime archives. Some documents have been released, but others remain classified, fueling suspicion that the Vatican possesses knowledge of political deals never revealed. Historians are still debating how much more the Church knew, and chose not to disclose, about the crimes of that era. The Vatican's role in empire, then, is not only a story of treaties and charters, but also of complicity, silence, and hidden knowledge. To possess documents that reveal colonial brutality, secret negotiations, or political bargains is to hold history's uncomfortable truths. The Church, by keeping them sealed, preserves not only the evidence but also the power to decide when, or if, they will ever be seen. In this light, the archives are less a library and more a vault of global memory. Within their shelves may lie maps that redrew continents, letters that described massacres in forgotten villages, or drafts of treaties that carved the world without the consent of its peoples. If revealed, they would remind humanity that empire was not only forged with swords and ships, but also with pens, parchment, and papal seals. If documents and treaties filled the Vatican's shelves, there are also persistent claims that physical relics, bones, artifacts, even objects of power, rest in its sealed chambers. While the archives are most often associated with manuscripts, the Vatican is also custodian of treasures collected across centuries, relics of saints, fragments of the true cross, bones attributed to apostles, and countless devotional objects. Yet some believe that behind locked doors lie stranger items still, objects not merely sacred but disruptive, challenging the boundaries of accepted history. From the earliest days of Christianity, relics were central to devotion. Pilgrims journeyed to see fragments of martyrs' bones or cloth touched to their tombs. Bishops and popes carefully guarded such relics, both for their spiritual value and their ability to inspire loyalty. By the Middle Ages, Rome had become a hub for relics from across the Christian world. Many were displayed openly, but others, those whose authenticity was uncertain or whose nature was troubling, may have been quietly set aside. The archives, with their climate-controlled chambers and guarded halls, would have been the natural place to preserve them. An authoritative reference to this practice comes from the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, which decreed that relics could not be displayed without papal approval. This law reflected both a concern for authenticity and a desire for control. Yet what of the relics denied approval? Historians are still debating whether such items were destroyed, or whether they were quietly absorbed into the Vatican's hidden collections. If the latter, the archives may hold hundreds of relics never seen by the faithful, locked away because they raise more questions than answers. Among the most persistent rumors is that the Vatican possesses skeletal remains that do not fit within ordinary human history. Some claim that bones of unusual size, interpreted in the past as those of giants, were discovered in Europe and sent to Rome. Medieval chronicles across France, Ireland, and Italy describe the unearthing of enormous skeletons, often linked to biblical Nephilim. Whether these were merely fossilized animals misidentified or something more, the accounts reached clerical ears. A few modern researchers speculate that the Vatican collected and suppressed such remains to avoid conflict with Scripture. Another category of rumored artifacts are pagan objects seized during the Christianization of Europe. Temples were converted to churches, and their statues and idols destroyed, or in some cases transported to Rome. It is plausible that papal officials kept examples of these objects, studying them to better understand the faiths they sought to replace. If such artifacts exist in the archives, they would provide a startling window into pre-Christian religions across Europe and the Mediterranean. Stranger stories reach back to the Crusades. Knights returning from the Holy Land carried relics, manuscripts, and treasures seized from conquered cities. Some were donated to cathedrals, others disappeared into private hands. But many, it is said, were presented to the Pope. These included chalices, icons, and even rumored fragments of the Ark of the Covenant. While such claims remain speculative, they illustrate how easily war spoils could have entered papal custody, disappearing thereafter into silence. Historians are still debating whether any such relics truly survive in the Vatican, or whether they are no more than legends. One peculiar anecdote comes from the 17th century, when antiquarians whispered that the Vatican possessed a skull with elongated features found in a Roman crypt. Some described it as evidence of an ancient people with unusual physiology, others dismissed it as a malformed specimen. The story faded but reappeared in 19th-century speculative works about lost races. No such artifact has ever been shown, yet the fact that it was associated with the Vatican underscores the enduring fascination with what the archives may conceal. The archives are also rumored to contain artifacts linked to early Christianity, chalices used by the apostles, fragments of letters written by Paul, even household objects from the families of saints. While the Vatican has never confirmed such claims, it is well known that early Christians preserved relics of their faith wherever possible. Catacombs beneath Rome yielded items buried for safekeeping. Many of these objects are displayed in museums, but others may have been stored privately, judged too fragile or too controversial for display. Historians are still debating how much weight to give to these rumors. Some argue that the Vatican has no reason to hide relics. Others suggest that objects contradicting traditional chronology or theology would be locked away to avoid confusion among the faithful. The presence of real relics, like the bones beneath St. Peter's Basilica, excavated in the 20th century and identified as belonging to a man of the 1st century, shows that the Vatican does preserve ancient remains. Whether stranger relics lie deeper within remains unknown. One off-topic but intriguing story involves indigenous artifacts taken during missionary campaigns in the Americas. Some sources suggest that codices, statues, and ritual objects confiscated from native peoples were shipped to Rome rather than destroyed. If true, the archives might contain irreplaceable treasures of Aztec or Inca culture, preserved even as their civilizations were dismantled. These items, if ever revealed, could expand our understanding of pre-Columbian spirituality and history. The archive's rumored relics, bones, idols, chalices, scrolls, blur the line between history and myth. Some may be genuine, others misidentified, still others legends born of secrecy. But all serve the same purpose. They remind us that the Vatican is not merely a storehouse of words, but a keeper of objects that carry the weight of belief, memory, and fear. Each artifact, if it exists, would alter the way humanity sees its past. In the silence of the archives, relics may rest beside manuscripts, objects beside words, waiting for a day when the locks might open. Whether that day comes remains uncertain. Until then, the Vatican holds not only the story of empires and gospels, but also the tangible remains of forgotten worlds. Over the centuries, glimpses into the Vatican's sealed vaults have been rare. Yet every so often, a document is uncovered, an accident occurs, or a researcher stumbles across something that should not have been there. And suddenly, the world is reminded of just how vast and mysterious the archives remain. These new discoveries and controversial leaks, whether authentic or exaggerated, have only deepened the sense of enigma surrounding the Vatican's hidden collections. In 1881, Pope Leo XIII opened portions of the archives to accredited scholars, an act hailed as unprecedented. For the first time, researchers could request access to papal letters, treaties, and council records. This partial transparency was meant to encourage serious scholarship, but it also reinforced suspicions. Scholars quickly noticed that certain categories of documents were entirely off-limits or simply absent from catalogs. They asked, were these sections too sensitive to release, or had they been deliberately concealed? Historians are still debating whether the Vatican's policy of selective openness was a gesture of goodwill or a strategy to distract from what remained hidden. An authoritative example of such partial disclosure is the release of Galileo's trial documents. Though long preserved, they were not made widely available until the late 19th century. Their publication confirmed what many had long suspected, that Galileo had been condemned more for challenging authority than for scientific error. Yet the fact that it took centuries for these documents to be shown only fueled speculation about what else might lie sealed away. The 20th century brought further controversies. During the Second World War, Pope Pius XII maintained diplomatic relations with both Axis and Allied powers. His cautious neutrality has since been criticized as silence in the face of atrocity. In recent decades, some of the wartime archives have been opened to scholars, revealing the complexity of the Vatican's diplomacy. Yet many files remain sealed, particularly those relating to Jewish refugees and Vatican awareness of the Holocaust. Historians are still debating whether unreleased documents might show the Church acting more decisively than is known, or more complicitly. The uncertainty ensures that controversy endures. Leaks and rumors often accompany these debates. In the 1960s, a story circulated that the Vatican had confiscated the so-called Chronicles of Enoch, an apocryphal text said to describe angels descending from the heavens. Though scholars dismiss the tale as a modern fabrication, it reflects the hunger to imagine what hidden scriptures might lie beyond reach. Another rumor claimed that microfilms of secret manuscripts were stolen during World War II and remain hidden in private collections. Although evidence has surfaced, the story illustrates how easily the archives inspire both myth and paranoia. One peculiar discovery occurred in 2012, when scholars working in the Vatican Library uncovered fragments of a long-lost homily by Origen, the early Christian theologian. The manuscript had lain misfiled for centuries, unnoticed. Its recovery demonstrated that genuine treasures can still be found even within the catalog sections of the archives. If such discoveries emerge from open shelves, what might exist in the closed corridors? An even stranger episode came in 2019, when Pope Francis authorized the release of archives from Pius XII's papacy. Within months, researchers uncovered letters from German bishops pleading for stronger papal condemnation of Nazi policies. These revelations complicated the narrative of Vatican silence, yet some scholars noted that not all requested files were made available, suggesting that sensitive materials remain withheld. This selective release echoes a familiar pattern: a glimpse given, the rest concealed. Off-topic stories, too, have attached themselves to the archive's mystique. In the 1990s, an Italian journalist claimed he had been shown a manuscript describing contact between early Jesuits and a tribe of shining beings in the Andes. The Vatican denied the claim, and the story was dismissed. Yet the idea that such fantastical reports might exist reflects how powerfully the archives fuel imagination. The hypothesis that more remains hidden is strengthened by the very scale of the collection. With more than 85 kilometers of shelving, the archives are too vast to have been fully explored even by authorized scholars. Misfiled manuscripts, overlooked boxes, and sealed envelopes may hold discoveries waiting to surface. Each new fragment found strengthens the belief that far greater secrets lie in wait. Historians are still debating how much of what is rumored is real. Are the archives truly hiding revelations about lost civilizations, apocryphal gospels, or alien encounters? Or are these legends projections of human imagination, filling the silence with stories? The answer may never be clear, but the occasional emergence of genuine, unexpected documents keeps speculation alive. In this sense, the archives are not only a vault of the past but also a mirror of the present. Each generation finds in their secrecy what it most desires or fears: forbidden science, hidden heresies, or political complicity. Each discovery, no matter how small, confirms both the richness of the collection and the impossibility of ever knowing its full extent. The Vatican's silence ensures that even leaks and partial disclosures become part of the mystery. To this day, researchers work in small reading rooms, requesting limited manuscripts at a time, watched closely by archivists. The secrecy is both practical and symbolic, ensuring that the archives remain not only a repository of history but also a living myth, a reminder that humanity's story is never fully told. As glimpses and controversies accumulate, speculation inevitably turns to the broader question: what if the Vatican's archives preserve not fragments, but the very key to humanity's hidden story? The idea may seem fantastical, but it is precisely the absence of certainty that fuels hypotheses. Within those sealed holds could lie documents that explain the origins of civilization, migrations long forgotten, encounters with forces we cannot yet define, or sciences once silenced. If so, the Vatican does not merely preserve history, it conceals the true history of humanity. One hypothesis is that the archives contain records of humanity's beginnings, accounts far older than Genesis. Ancient Mesopotamian tablets describe gods who fashioned humankind from clay. Egyptian papyri tell of divine kings ruling before dynasties, and Indian texts speak of cycles of ages stretching back millions of years. Missionaries and travelers encountered these traditions across the centuries, often sending translations to Rome. If preserved, They could reveal a vision of human origins not as a single moment of creation, but as a long, complex evolution of myth and memory. Historians are still debating whether the Vatican intentionally suppressed such records to protect biblical chronology, or whether they simply considered them cultural curiosities best left in silence. Another hypothesis concerns the great migrations of antiquity. Archaeology now shows that humans traveled farther and earlier than once believed, to Australia by 50,000 years ago, to the Americas by at least 15,000. Oral traditions of indigenous peoples describe journeys across seas and skies. Did missionaries record these stories, and did their reports find their way to Rome? If so, the archives might hold narratives of global connection long before modern discovery. The archives may also conceal records of lost sciences, alchemical treatises, astronomical charts, and medical manuscripts could suggest that earlier civilizations possessed knowledge more advanced than their time. A peculiar story from the 17th century tells of a Jesuit who claimed to have seen in China scrolls describing gunpowder centuries before its European introduction. He allegedly sent notes to Rome. If such documents survive, they remind us that what we call discovery is often rediscovery, knowledge passed from hand to hand and then forgotten. Stranger still are the whispers of encounters with beings beyond the ordinary, visions of angels, reports of luminous visitors, and tales of sky chariots appear across cultures. If the Vatican preserves such accounts, whether as heretical delusions or as mysteries awaiting interpretation, they may reveal a pattern stretching across centuries, that humanity has always felt itself observed by something greater. Historians are still debating whether such parallels are coincidence, myth, or testimony to experiences we have yet to understand. Artifacts, too, may play a role in this hidden story. Rumors of giant bones, pagan idols, or relics from vanished civilizations suggest that the archives could house physical evidence contradicting accepted history. One off-topic anecdote often retold in speculative circles claims that in the 19th century, workers renovating beneath the Vatican stumbled upon sarcophagi inscribed with unknown symbols. The Vatican, it is said, immediately sealed the site. Whether fact or legend, the story illustrates how secrecy encourages belief in concealed origins. The hypothesis of a suppressed history also encompasses political choices. By controlling which documents were released, the Church could shape narratives of empire, discovery, and faith. The archives might show that Europe's age of exploration was preceded by earlier voyages, or that great powers knew more than they admitted. Such revelations would not only alter history, but also expose the mechanisms by which history is written. What unites these theories is the idea that humanity's story is incomplete. The Vatican's silence acts as a blank page onto which every generation projects its questions. In the Enlightenment, people imagined hidden gospels. In the 19th century, they dreamed of lost continents. In the modern age, they wonder about extraterrestrial visitors. The archives remain constant, an impenetrable backdrop to shifting human curiosity. Historians are still debating how much weight to give these hypotheses. Some argue that the Vatican contains nothing extraordinary, only bureaucratic records, treaties, and correspondence. Others insist that the sheer scale of the collection makes it inevitable that extraordinary materials lie within. Both positions may hold some truth. Perhaps the archives contain not one great revelation, but 1,000 small ones, fragments that, if pieced together, show a story far richer than we have known. The possibility is itself transformative. To imagine that the Vatican shelters the true history of humanity is to admit that our understanding of the past may always be provisional, always subject to revision. Whether those revisions come through archaeology, through leaked documents, or through an unexpected discovery on a Vatican shelf, they remind us that history is never finished. It waits, quietly, for revelation. In the dim holes of the archives, among kilometers of parchment and leather, humanity's story may lie dormant. Not the story told in textbooks, but the story whispered in myths, hinted at in ruins, concealed in coded letters and forgotten gospels. Whether we will ever see it remains uncertain. Until then, the Vatican's silence is itself part of the tale, a reminder that some truths are not denied, they are simply withheld. As the long corridors of the Vatican's archives fade from imagination back into silence, one is left with the lingering thought that history may not be what it seems. For centuries, stories have accumulated around those sealed doors, hidden gospels that challenge faith, chronicles of catastrophes that reset civilizations, treaties that divided continents, artifacts that question our origins, and even letters describing skies alive with unearthly lights. Whether true or imagined, these stories remind us of something deeper, that humanity has always suspected its history is incomplete, and that somewhere, the missing chapters are waiting. The archives embody that suspicion. They are at once a library and a labyrinth, part fact, part legend. They hold records of councils and kings, but also perhaps fragments of knowledge too strange to release. Their very secrecy gives them power. By keeping certain truths locked away, the Vatican ensures that curiosity never rests, that questions always persist. Historians are still debating whether the silence conceals revelation or simply ordinary bureaucracy. But either way, the mystery endures. If the archives were opened fully, what would happen? Perhaps nothing earth-shattering. Perhaps only dusty treaties and old letters would emerge. Or perhaps entire civilizations, once dismissed as myth, would step into light. Perhaps science would discover that its revolutions had ancient precedents. Perhaps humanity would realize that its story stretches further, deeper, stranger than it dared to imagine. The possibility itself is what matters, for it keeps alive the sense that the world is not fully known, that history has not yet spoken its final word. And so the narrative closes not with revelation, but with reflection. The Vatican's secret archives remain locked, their shelves stretching endlessly into shadow. Their guardians continue their silence. The world waits, as it has for centuries. Some truths may never emerge, and perhaps that is for the best. For knowledge can heal, but it can also disrupt, unsettle, and divide. To hold the world's deepest secrets may be both a burden and a safeguard. The mystery is not only in what is hidden, but in why it is hidden. In the end, the archives are less a vault of facts than a mirror of humanity's longing, for certainty, for wonder, for stories that make sense of the unknown. Whether or not they contain the true history of humanity, they remind us that curiosity itself is eternal. And now, as the story slows and the echoes of speculation soften, let the thought of those silent shelves drift into the background. Imagine the cool stillness of stone holes, the quiet hum of centuries asleep, a sense that somewhere behind locked doors, secrets slumber undisturbed. There is no need to solve the riddle tonight. The questions will wait. The mystery will remain. Good night.